Scripture reading this morning will be from John chapter 11, verses 17 through 26. John 11, 17 through 26. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would have not died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" You may be seated.
Good morning. When Natalie and I bought our first house in Colorado, our only house actually at this point, I feel like every house that you buy has some bonus features that you didn't know came with it in the purchase. And as a kid in a candy shop, it was the first big purchase that we had made. I went in the house and I started opening up all the closet doors, making sure everything was working. And it was one of those winter days in Colorado where it had snowed a few days before, but then the same sun came out and it was a beautiful, gorgeous, sunny day, nice cool breeze flowing throughout the day. And so I went in and I started opening up all the windows. I got to the first window in the house and tried to open it, and it didn't open, and I thought, oh, maybe it's just locked. And so I flipped the locks over and tried to open it, and it still refused to open. I thought, well, that's fine, we have more windows. So I went over to the next window in the house and tried to open that one. And this one had a pretty cool feature to it. Whenever I'd open it up, it would close automatically. I never had to worry about leaving that one open. So I just thought, well, there's more windows in the house, that's fine. So I went upstairs and I opened up a sliding window. This one worked the other way against gravity, so it wouldn't close itself. And I opened it and it got halfway and then got caught and then made a horrible screeching noise at that point. So I left it alone and closed that one and realized there are other windows in this house, I'm sure, and lo and behold, most of the windows in the house were broken. I don't know what was going on in the house, if it was just lack of maintenance or what kind of parties were thrown in the house where the windows just didn't operate fully. And I just kind of took a back seat in my mind because we had a big glass door in our back of the house that I would open up, and we'd open up the front door if we wanted a nice breeze through it. Don't need windows anyways. And then I started getting mail from the previous owner. Well, actually, it was for the previous owner, and it was a lot of things about windows and selling windows and things like that. I thought, well, maybe he just wanted to sign up for window packages and see what kind of features were out there. And he left us with this incredible mailing list of windows. And then with a little bit more research, I came to find out that the previous owner of our house owned a company that repaired and replaced windows in residential homes. And I thought, how interesting that he was so busy looking at all the other windows of people's houses that he neglected his own house. And I think there's a truth and a principle to that sometimes we get so caught up in the lives of other people and so caught up in trying to fix problems and assess situations and take care of other things that within our own lives, within our own homes, we sometimes neglect the very thing that we're good at, and that is service and ministry. Sometimes that really flows and kind of connects with us, that we can get so caught up and so busy in ministry and service and activities and events and everything else that we sometimes neglect what's going on internally and going on spiritually within ourselves. So this morning, I want to spend a couple moments just talking about this idea of the forgotten ministry, or even sometimes the neglected ministry, and that is the ministry of self. And without trying to be a self-conceited minister or someone who's just going to be selfish and teaching about self, I think that we find this very principle within Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Many of you know this story about Mary and Martha. But Mary and Martha in fact, it was actually Martha who invited Jesus into the house as he was coming into a town. And what we notice in chapter 10, verse 39 of Luke, it says, and she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. And while she was sitting and listening to Jesus, Martha was distracted with what the text says, much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. And Jesus' response was probably not what she was expecting. He said, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, and it will not be taken away from her. Within this quick, inspirational story of Mary and Martha, we can pull several different truths from it, but I think one of the primary things is looking at what Mary did upon contact of Jesus. As she didn't get so carried away with all the cares and distractions and services that she could do for others, Mary wanted to know, who is this Christ? Who is this individual that others are talking about? Who is this one who claims to be the Son of God, the Messiah? There's a lot that has taken place in the Gospel of Luke already, as Luke is creating this orderly account of Jesus, a biography of sorts of who this is, written directly toward Theophilus. But Mary is wondering, who is this Christ, and what does it mean for me? Well, very quickly this morning, I want to share 2 points from Mary and what she did in looking at Jesus. Number one is that Mary sat with Jesus. Very simple. And I think it's something that we've all had an experience of doing and sitting with Jesus and getting to know who this Christ is. But one of the things that I want to notice is that Jesus doesn't seek a distant relationship from his followers. Many people claim to know God, but they deny him in their actions. Titus chapter 1 and verse 16. There are people in this life who will say, oh yeah, I know God, or I'm a Christian. C.S. Lewis would kick back against the label of Christians because sometimes we say, are you a good Christian or a bad Christian? It shouldn't have those different descriptive words. It should really just come down to, are you a Christian? Are you one who follows Jesus in your life? Jesus doesn't want us running past him constantly. And I think it's kind of neat and maybe even important within the inspired writing of Luke that it notes that Mary sat at the feet of Jesus. You know what you can't do when you're sitting? Run. I don't know if you've ever tried that. It probably is a teenage activity for a lock-in or something like that in the gym where you're sitting and running around and doing the crab walk. But when we sit with Jesus, it means that we are taking time away from our day to get to know him more and to spend time with him and getting to know who he is. And I promise you, the more that you learn about this Christ, the more encouraged and comforted and inspired that you will be. Sitting at the feet of Jesus is an opportunity that I feel like most people will pass up in this world. But it is such an incredible experience to see the peace and to see the authority and to see the majesty of God in the flesh. But number two, when we look at sitting with Jesus, what we notice is if Jesus had to pick, he would prefer your devotion to him over your deeds for him. And I don't want to say this in a condescending way or a contradictory way, and obviously I believe that our decisions will help us guide us to salvation. It's ultimately God who provides that salvation, that we're not a works-based faith, but that we believe in God and we believe in God in salvation, but it also requires things on our end. That's not what I'm saying this morning. What I'm saying is that when Jesus talked to Martha, he said that Mary chose the good portion. That between the two different figures, one who was constantly worried and stressing about different services, and one who was just completely devoted to Jesus, Jesus said Mary chose the good portion. It was his preference. It was his favoring side, is that Mary was going to be the one to show devotion to him. And what's interesting is we see Mary all throughout the other Gospels and how she performs her devotion and what actions flow from that. Let me give you something to consider. I have seen people who do good things for Jesus but aren't devoted to Jesus. There are people like celebrities or sports figures who will set up charities, and they'll say, I'm doing this for God, or I'm giving God praise and glory, and I'm so thankful for God. Or you see actresses and actors winning awards and saying it's because of God, and they promote God. but how they live their life is contradictory toward knowing Jesus. It takes a full devotion to Christ. But on the contrary, even though I've seen people do good things for Jesus without yet knowing Jesus fully, I've never met someone who is devoted to Jesus who does not have good deeds. And so what we see from Luke chapter 10, verse 38 through 42, is that Jesus primarily puts focus on the devotion toward Him, because then what follows are the deeds. But it is very possible for people in this world to live their life doing good deeds, but never having an experiential relationship with the Christ. So Jesus therefore puts an emphasis on pure devotion to Him. I think it's interesting that we see different times within the New Testament where Jesus would warn against deeds or things that come between Him and absolute devotion. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, Jesus would kind of warn people, be careful not to practice your righteousness to be seen by men and not to be seen by your Father, for you have no reward with your Father if you do those things in that way. It's possible to do deeds in a wrong way. More than that, it's also possible to be so fixated on the law of God that we forget the devotion side of being with Jesus. If you look at Matthew chapter 19 and verse 16, there was a man, and your head title probably calls him something like the rich young ruler. And he comes to Jesus, and apparently he's kept the law pretty perfectly, except for he's missing one thing. And he asks Jesus, what is that one thing? And Jesus says, go and sell all your possessions and give them to the poor. And what would follow from that is Jesus' teaching on how there are things in this life, such as prosperity and success and monetary wealth, that can sometimes become a stumbling block to you and your devotion to Christ. Jesus prefers your devotion to Him over your deeds for Him. And really how that plays out within the context of Luke, and please, hopefully I'm not coming across contradictory here, but what Jesus is saying is if you show devotion to Him, the deeds will follow. And I think that's what James talks about as well in James chapter 2. That if you have a faith toward Christ, an absolute devotion, then those services and those deeds will follow suit. If we keep on going on this idea of ministering to self and keeping up with self, one of the things that comes to mind is maintenance. If you've owned a vehicle or driven a vehicle for any amount of time, maybe you've seen these warning lights come on. It's interesting, I was reading an article the other day, maybe it was part satire, maybe it was part truth, but it was asking people, what do these different symbols on your car dashboard mean? And there are some people that think that this is the genie in the lamp, and when this shows up, you get 3 wishes. And I would hope for your sake, if this light shows up on your dashboard, that one of those wishes is, please don't let my engine blow up. That's a low oil indicator, and time to get some maintenance done and oil change. This one, some people have said the robots are here. We've been warned about AI and all the different robot-generated AI and everything else. Well, they're here, so your car is warning you. No. What that's warning you is that your battery is dead and you need to seek attention immediately. And then some have been watching Frozen too much. Whenever the frost comes up, it's let it go, and that's the last thing you should be doing when this indicator shows up, because that means that the roads are probably slick and it's a frost warning. While partially humorous in one vein, another side of that shows a reality that some people don't know what these indicators mean. And by not knowing what these indicators mean or not paying attention to them or just kind of carrying on with their driving, they put themselves at risk of breaking down. And I think that there are moments within Scripture that people have indicators that are flashing on their dashboard saying, it's time for self-maintenance. It's time for you to spend time with Jesus, to stop running, stop walking, and sit with Jesus. Let me share 3 indicators that show us that we might need some time with God. Indicator number 1 is that we sometimes find ourselves saying, I've had enough. In 1 Kings chapter 19, this is coming off of the heels of Elijah and the prophets about Baal on Mount Carmel. And Elijah has had this incredible experience of showing and proving that God is God. And what's interesting about 1 Kings chapter 19 is if you look at it, the verse before chapter 19, 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 46, it says, "The hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and outran Ahab unto where you entered Jezreel." You know what's interesting about Elijah in this standpoint when you read 1 Kings chapter 19? Is that Elijah was not only a minister of God, but Elijah was one who experienced God in great and majestic ways. And what that tells me is that ministers or servants of God are not immune to depression. It's just a simple fact. That even though you would say that you're a servant of God or that you're a minister of God, it doesn't mean that you can just forget about this breaking down moment. In fact, when we look at 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 4, Elijah will say this himself. He asked for himself that he might die, and he said, in my translation, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I'm not better than my fathers." Ahab and Jezebel and their army were coming to seek the life of Elijah. And Elijah thought, this is it. This is the end of my life. Lord, just take my life. This is what's going to happen anyways. But what's interesting is in the Hebrew, it just comes down to one word. The phrase, "I've had enough," that is translated in the NIV, or "it is enough" in the New American or ESV. The word is just rav in the Hebrew. And the word ra in Hebrew literally just means too much or big or much. It's a pretty simple word. Elijah hit a standpoint in his life where he realized it's too much or I've had enough. In fact, this word is used again in the context of 1 Kings chapter 19. If you look at verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord came down a second time and touched him. So he arose and he drank. And he said, 'Arise, because the journey is too great for you.'" The Hebrew word rav there appears again. The journey is too great. Elijah is saying that this life has become too great, too much for me. There are points in your service or in your ministry where you might say, "I have had enough." But you know what's interesting about Elijah is he got to experience God again. God wasn't found in the earthquake. God wasn't found in the great wind. God wasn't found in the fire, but God was found in the gentle whisper. It's interesting how sometimes we might be looking for God in grand places and perhaps we'll find him there. But I would argue sometimes God is in the most unsuspecting and quiet and gentle moments of our life. If you find yourself saying, "I have had enough," maybe it's time that you take some maintenance and you sit with Jesus. Or another indicator is you will say, "It's all up to me." Exodus chapter 18 and verse 5 there, Moses is judging between the people, and he's trying to live out this task of taking care of other people's problems. In Exodus chapter 18, verse 15, should say 15, not 5, Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. And when they have a matter, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor and make known the statutes of God and his laws." Verse 17, "And Moses' father-in-law said to him, 'The thing that you are doing is not good.'" Well, how could you say something like, Jethro? I mean, Moses is trying to inform these people and guide these people and lead these people in a good direction. And Jethro says, "The thing that you're doing is not good." Keep on reading in that passage. He says in verse 18, "You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." When we have this "it's all up to me" mentality, according to Exodus chapter 18, we will burn out. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Moreover, what Jethro is saying is you will wear out both yourself and the people. It's not a win-win for anyone. It's a lose-lose situation. And Jethro would then give him advice to delegate and to separate this work out and to make the work more efficient and effective. And what's interesting about Jethro's advice is he constantly includes God in that plan. Select for you men who know God, who are righteous, and God will be with you. Sometimes God with us looks like the church around us. When we come to this point of saying, "It's all up to me, I have so much to do," then maybe it's time to ask for help. And I know that is not the American ideal, but maybe it's time to ask for help. Maybe it's time to ask for counsel. Maybe it's time to seek comfort from those around you. A third indicator or a warning light that may pop up in your life is the idea of what's the point. In Job chapter 7, Job is already being influenced by all the things around him falling apart. And in Job chapter 7, he utilizes a phrase that we would know very familiar from Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 2. He says, "My life is a breath." But really, he's saying my life is hevel, the Hebrew word for worthless, for vanity, for meaningless. Job is at a point in his life where he says, what's the point? What's the meaning? Where does this all end up? And what's interesting is we still have a lot of Job left to cover by the time he says that in chapter 7. There's still more to add on to that, including his miserable friends or his horrible comforters, according to Job chapter 19. But you know what's interesting? You know what pulled Job out of that mentality and pulled Job back to a place of peace and comfort? It was spending time with God. And maybe it is that one of the greatest trials that Job had during his suffering was not the loss of his economy or the loss of his family, but it was the lack of communication and direct connection with God. God was still there, but it was a period of trial and testing because God knew that Job would overcome in the end. But what took place was Job coming to a place where he was able to speak with God and know that God is powerful and that God is still God and that God can restore all things back to life. There may be a point in your ministry or in your service where you think, what's the point? This is all meaningless. This is all chevel, if you want to use the Hebrew word. But God shows that there is purpose, that there is a point. And I'm thankful that Job didn't give up, because we read that book and all of its chapters and we find so much encouragement and so much comfort all these years later. But number two, Mary didn't only sit with Jesus. We can't leave it there. I think there's a lot to be said about sitting with Jesus and learning from Him and seeing Him as He is. But also, she listened to Jesus. Now, there's a lot of speculation. What was it that Jesus was teaching Mary at this time, and eventually Martha? We know what Jesus taught Martha, but what was it that Jesus was teaching Mary? Well, we don't know exactly what it was, but if we were to just recount all that has taken place in Luke prior to Luke chapter 10, there are a few things of comfort and a few things of interest as we look at the teachings of Jesus, and that is number one, that Jesus brings good news. As Jesus began His ministry, He opened up the book or the scroll of Isaiah, and He read it before the synagogue, and He quoted from Isaiah chapter 61, which tells us that in those days there would be someone who would send release or give freedom to the captives. That Jesus was going to be here, and He would be the one who would proclaim or preach good news. And this is what would follow through, I would argue, the rest of the Gospel of Luke, is that Jesus preaches good news. And let me tell you, it's good news. When we understand who Jesus is and what He did for us and where we were, it's good news. Do you realize where we're going? Where God has promised us to a land of eternal bliss, without worry, without sin, without darkness, without sickness, without anything else to worry about, but that we will be in His presence for. Guys, that's good news. That's something that we rejoice in. That gives me life. That gives me comfort. It gives me energy to go out and to do more for Him. But it all starts with a relationship with Jesus. And so Jesus was teaching and preaching good news. That we don't have to stay in our sin. That we don't have to stay in our horrible state of wickedness and deception and bad news. But that Jesus takes us out of that. Jesus was also preaching that you are broken and that He wants to help. Notice Jesus' statement in Luke chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. He says, "It is not those who are well who need a physician, but those who are sick." There are people who will say, well, you don't know the things that I've done in my life. You're right, maybe I don't, but Jesus already does. You know, that's what makes Him God, is Jesus knows what you've done. And you know what Jesus does? He doesn't run away from it. He runs to you. And Jesus wants to help walk you through your brokenness. And not only walk you through it, but give you life, give you new meaning. when we look at what Jesus provides in this new life at the Sermon on the Plain in Luke chapter 6, verse 20 through 49, as well as in 7:36 through 50, is that Jesus flips the world upside down in its way of thinking, and he says that you may be poor in this world, you may be mourning in this world, you may be broken in this world, but I am going to give you a different life that this world has never seen. I'm going to give you an opportunity to grow in ways that you never knew that you could. I'm going to give you an opportunity to see you as God sees you, and that is loved. And sometimes we really introspectively find a lot of hate against ourselves if we were to stop and pause. There are a lot of things that I don't like about myself. There are a lot of things that I do that I think, I need to be better about that. You know how God sees me? Loved. You know how God sees you? Loved. And God sees you and He loves you so much that He gave His Son for you to give you new life. But also notice that Jesus' message is ultimately your choice. The parable of the sowers, Jesus is not going to force you into salvation. He's not going to force you into what He teaches and what He wants, but He leaves it to you. And this is maybe a very important or maybe a paramount point of the message of Jesus, is that He brings good news. Whether you accept that good news or not is up to you. It's your choice. And it's all based on that relationship that you have with Him. And lastly, up to Luke chapter 10, Jesus' message is salvation. That Jesus brings new life, a life that is promised that we can't promise ourselves. As we start to wrap up this morning, I want to leave you with a couple things in terms of what does it look like to minister to self. Sometimes ministering to yourself means making time with your church friends. And let me make a clear distinction that auditorium friendships are different than table relationships. That we sometimes do really good about making friendships in the auditorium, and we only see those people once a week. We were looking through our receipts, and we saw a lot of meals with college kids and getting to spend some time with them. And I was reflecting back on what a blessing it's been in our ministry to be able to spend time across a table sharing a meal with someone. What a blessing it's been to go to different sports activities and different games and things like that with these college kids. It's a blessing to make our friendships go beyond the walls of the auditorium. It's a blessing that we share a common faith and that we can have that and pull each other up and encourage one another. Make time for your church friends. Attend lectureships or seminars. There are many lectureships within the brotherhood all over the country. And there are even places where you can go that aren't flat, that have mountains, that you can enjoy some of the scenery while also attending a lectureship or a seminar. But these things, being able to hear more lessons about Jesus, being able to hear Him speak more in our lives. Consider a spiritual-centric vacation. Sometimes we really do a good job of retreating to Disneyland and Universal, and it's not that I'm slamming those at all. Natalie said she's never seen me happier than when we were at Universal Studios, and so maybe that says something to my character. But consider taking a vacation that is spiritually focused, going somewhere where you can really reflect upon God's majesty, and spending some time away from work and from responsibilities at home to really soak in who God is and what He's done for you. Take a break from social media and technology. I've talked with many different counselors and those who are in school for counseling and guidance, and they say that social media is one of the greatest inducers of anxiety. Maybe it's time that we take a break from those things and to focus more on God. And lastly, and maybe this is a wrench and something that kind of goes counterintuitive to what we've learned this morning about Mary and Martha, but serve others. When I was in Paris, Tennessee, was my first full-time ministry that I had been part of, and one of my obligations was to go to the assisted living and do a worship with them on Tuesday mornings and to spend some time with them and then come back to the building so that I could study for Wednesday night class. And I thought, as a 19-year-old, well, I've got charisma. I'll go and cheer these people up and give them something to look forward to, and I'll have such a grand time with them and give them new life. And what I learned after a couple weeks is that I wasn't necessarily ministering to them as much as they were ministering to me. It was an opportunity that I took to serve, and I thought, okay, well, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to be the one serving. And so many times I found myself eating their cafeteria food, talk about suffering for others, with the people at the assisted living, and them giving me coaching and life tips and wisdom. And there were times where I was asking relationship advice, where I was asking job advice. And when I left Paris, Tennessee, I had this newfound respect of serving others. In fact, most times that I can recount when I've taken on an opportunity to serve others, I have walked away thinking, that was such a blessing to me. That was something that has been good to me and good for my soul. When we think about the forgotten ministry of self, it's so easy to be like the previous homeowners where we run past our own estate to help others. And that's good. In fact, you will never find a verse in Scripture that talks about stop doing good. In fact, Jesus would promote the opposite. Continue to do good. Do not grow weary of doing good, as Paul would say. But at the same level, it starts with us. And it starts with making sure that we are ministering to ourselves as well in that group of collective people and collective individuals. This morning, the invitation is simple. I want to leave you with the idea that before we can minister to others, we must minister to ourselves. There's no way that you can pour out of an empty cup. Tim said that there's no way that you could take a dry sponge and squeeze water out of it. We need to fill ourselves up. And if you found yourself this morning in a position where you think to yourself, I need help, as Jethro told Moses, or as Elijah needed the presence of God in that moment, we want to encourage you together as we stand and as we sing.